Hey, it's Omer Azulai, and it's more than an honor to welcome you to the 11th chapter of the Passive Listening for Horses. Today we have Dr. Philip Tedeschi for the Department of Horses and People or Animal and Human Relationship in the University of Denver, who did a lot of research about therapeutic work and actually we're going to talk with him a little bit about how we as a society can learn more from animals and what is the legal aspect of it and how even like how compassion in therapy can be more effective. It was a very important conversation, at least for me, and I hope you will enjoy it. Welcome, Philip. Thank you for being with us and the willingness to share your story, your wisdom. Tell us a little bit about maybe the moment you discovered that you are want to be therapist with animal.
Mm, sure, absolutely. Tell me before I jump in, tell me where you are. Where are you located?
Right now, I'm in Scottsdale, Arizona. Originally, I'm from Israel.
Okay. So you're in Scottsdale, Arizona right at the moment.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Um, well, we're not too far away then. Um, well, let's see. It's been a windy process, a windy road. I have been interested in this topic most of my entire professional career, and I think it started with the assumption that I wanted to do veterinary medicine. Um, Quite early on, started doing all of the prerequisites for studying veterinary medicine, and um, during that, this was at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, and while I was doing that kind of academic work, I had a job as a veterinary technician, a student veterinary technician at the large animal veterinary hospital there. And one of the things that I ended up getting the opportunity to do was managing the entire the horse program there. Um, and at that time, I knew probably more about horses than I did about people. Um, and this would have been at a time in the United States history that was quite unique looking back because right about that same period of time, there were these investigative reports about the conditions of mental health institutions in the United States. There was a well-known investigative reporter who took his camera crews into the mental state hospitals around the country and revealed this terrible conditions for people that were living there. And the result of that was that it created a lot of concern by the public, and the Congress at that time then mandated the release of mentally ill persons from these mental hospitals, and it created a whole nother set of problems. One of the things that whole movement created was a lot of unhoused persons, people who had nowhere to live, who had mental health problems. Um, and so it went from kind of this one issue to the next. But the way it impacted me was I was asked by the Mental Health Institute in Madison, Wisconsin, if I would teach horseback riding to adults with schizophrenia, um, who were suffering from schizophrenia, and many of whom had not been outside of this institution for many, many years. And so that's what I agreed to do. I was, I was a college student at that time, but I knew how to teach horseback riding and had this opportunity to teach these newly deinstitutionalized individuals how to interact with horses and how to ride horses. And for me, that was kind of a turning point in my career where when I saw these individuals coming off this bus from the center and moving into the barn with me and watching them interact with horses, um, I could visibly notice changes in the ways that they were behaving. Um, so we saw more normal behaviors. We saw persons who started to engage in all kinds of expressions of affection, who began to talk more normally, who began to self-regulate, where the horses were, really driving this change right in front of our eyes. And this was now looking back, I'm talking over 40 years ago, probably now. Um, but for me, it changed my interest from veterinary medicine to human animal relationships. And I remember that, very day talking to my advisor and telling them I wanted to study human animal connection. And they immediately told me I shouldn't do that, that it was a bad idea. But I decided to do it anyways. And fortunately for me, I had been always interested in people and animals and been reading a lot about it and trying to learn. And there were key figures, and one of those key figures that became so central to me was Dr. Jane Goodall, who at the time was doing her research in Gombe National Park in Tanzania, and she and I became correspondents. I've had the fortune of knowing her throughout my career and having her as a supporter or a mentor in some ways. And in fact, in her final birthday books, her 80th birthday book, I was invited to write a chapter for her in her book because she was such a big influence on me. And what she really was teaching us was at that time was that our relationship with animals can teach us about ourselves, our own ways in which we interact with others or the living world. And she continued to do that her whole life up until this last year when she passed away. And even for anyone who follows Dr. Goodall knows that she's even talking to us from the grave now, about the importance of honoring our relationship with other animals. Um, and so my work, my academic trajectory changed right then and there. And I was given permission to write my own degree program. And the focus of that was called bio-affiliation, or, which was really based on the biophilia hypothesis and this deeper recognition that optimum human health really necessitates relationships with the living world. And when we look at it much closer, and really the work I've been doing more recently shows us it's not just the relationship. It is the relationship with flourishing aspects of the living world. So if we are interacting with our living planet or other non-human animals, and they are in distress or being harmed, we actually now know that those are direct health implications and risk factors for human well-being, and that when we're interacting with other animals that are flourishing or in environments that are flourishing, we also see the likelihood that people and their well-being and health are likely to also be benefited from those relationships. In any case, most of my academic work and research and scholarship has ended up focusing on trying to understand this interconnection between people and other animals.
I'm debating if to get specific to horses or to generalize to human and animal, but what are the lessons that we can take as a species from animals, from horses, even specifically?
It's a good question. You know, from my perspective, our relationship with horses as a culture, probably almost anywhere in the world, with very few exceptions, is not a very um, respectful relationship. I think in many cases, if not most cases, horses are stuck in a difficult kind of position where they're not exactly seen as companion animals in most cases. And they're not exactly seen as farmed animals either. So they live in this space that relies heavily on the human perspective of how to interact with them. And I would argue that there is a tremendous amount of evidence that we still are treating horses as if they are largely here for our own purposes and are quite coercive in our interactions with them in many cases, that we have fairly poor species specific welfare understanding of horses and to a large degree ignore much of the environmental and physical needs that these animals actually have. Um, the work that I am doing currently has shifted from being interested more in the therapeutic dimensions of this and has shifted more to the moral and ethical and legal ramifications of our relationship with other animals. So I run an institute called the Institute for Animal Sentience and Protection. That is a collaboration between the Graduate School of Social Work and the law school at the University of Denver. And one of the areas that we have been specializing in is the treatment of horses. Um, and and of course there are some horses that are in better circumstances than others, but we still continue to use horses in very um, intrusive and exploitive ways across many domains, including much of the recreation activities done with horses, the equipment that's used with horses, um, and and even the cultural phenomenon that tends to surround horses with still probably one of the most popular events in the, in certainly in Colorado, maybe in the Western United States, is the Western Stock Show that puts on display all different kinds of horsemanship that continue to display horses, physical capabilities or speed or varying forms of activities, but with very little attention to the actual cognition and emotions that horses are able to communicate with us. And horses are very sensitive animals, as probably you know. Um, they are animals that tend to, you know, be really quite refined in their neuroception of safety so that they are often communicating with us all the time about their comfortability in the circumstances that they're in. And yet at the same time, it appears to me a lot of the times as though human beings are not listening very carefully to those relationships. So I think, I guess to summarize kind of maybe your question, what can we take away from it? I think one of the things that we can learn about ourselves is our potential for arrogance in these relationships. That if we can control another individual, or in this case, a non-human, that in many cases we do. Um, and that it has, deep moral implications for the work that we do if we're incorporating horses into our therapeutic work. I think it really necessitates, or mandates really a much higher level of ethical regard for the work that we're doing if in fact we are going to incorporate them in therapeutic work.
So our ego, our tendency, but I'm curious how I'll say it. In the therapeutic world, and I'm coming from a competitive background with horses also, what we need as a society or as a people to be able to change that. Because right now, I can speak of my impression after going a little bit around the world and being in clinics and seeing some people do therapy with horses. In a lot of the industry, horses are suffering, and I'm curious, how does it affect even the communication between, let's say, a therapeutic place using lame horses, or let's say, does it change the therapy? Does it change the message that's coming to the patient?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I think that's almost without question now. And one of the exciting aspects of the stage that we're at in terms of the research and the science is that we have learned a lot more about the emotional lives of animals. And it's not as much of a mystery as it used to be. In fact, just probably just the opposite. Um, we have we have for many years had the consensus of the science and evidence, probably since 2013 in the Cambridge Declaration on Animal Consciousness that was done out of the UK, but made more recently, 2024, the New York Declaration on Animal Consciousness done at New York University, that had, most of the world's leading neuroscientists, including ethologists and other animal behaviorists and persons who have been studying animals, agree that the consensus should draw the conclusion that we should assume that almost all animals, when we're making decisions for them, almost all animals are capable of complex emotions and cognitions and make decisions from that position. Um, when it comes to thinking about horses specifically, um, the work. So in 2019, I published a book called Transforming Trauma that looked at a lot of the different dimensions of trauma and the roles that animals play in potentially therapeutic care of those individuals. I published this with my colleague Molly Jenkins through Purdue Press, and it was a wide-ranging book where we looked at child maltreatment, developmental trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder, crisis responses, things like school shootings and other situations like that, natural disasters. Um, and across the board, one of the single most important takeaways from that investigation was that as if the animal is in distress in some form or fashion, that the very mechanism that we believe alters and creates the therapeutic benefit for the human being is likely really not present. It could be even equatable to, I mean, this may be a slight change in perspectives, but we've known for years, for example, that taking somebody to a zoo, taking a child to a zoo where they're observing the behavior of a captive animal that is stressed out by being in a small enclosure and pacing in front of the bars, wants to get away, is struggling with their own physical and mental health, um, that those experiences are not only not educational to go to the zoo and teach children about animals that way, they're actually quite harmful because what we're teaching that child is to believe that what they're seeing is normative, is acceptable, is somehow, everyday ways in which those animals are functioning, but they're not. Those are actually much like watching a human prisoner closed in an isolation cell, or something equivalent to that. It's a difficult, isolating experience. It's painful for those animals. And as a result, you're looking at distress. You're teaching a child, how to look at an animal in distress. And at the same time, we may not be talking about that factor. I think many, as you're pointing out, many horses that are working in programs are in some version of that same expression of discomfort or distress, right? And we often will blame it on the animal, right? We might say, "Oh, that watch out for this horse. It's a biter, right? It's a nipper, or be careful, this horse might try to kick you, right? Or this horse has got a bad attitude or is grumpy." Um, we may see an animal that it's painful for them to have an equipment put on their bodies, or somebody sitting on their back. Just the nature of the very equipment that is designed for horses, particularly, high-level equestrian activities that are using, quite coercive materials. There's almost no comparison in almost anything that we do, really. Even, arguably, things like shock collars on dogs, possibly, right, or very severe punishment, but the use of a harsh bit in a horse's mouth, especially in the hands of somebody who is not a very qualified rider, is likely to be a horrible experience for that particular animal. The other thing we should probably mention alongside horses are other equids. Maybe the most difficultly treated animal on the face of the earth are donkeys, um, that are used all over the world for really harsh and heavy work, are treated, with very little dignity and care and humane treatment, and in some cases are in terrible shape. Um, in many cases, they are. We also have economic trades that surround the use of horses. So I think, and other equines. I think we have to remember that when a horse is not, engaging in the beautiful, whatever we determine are the beautiful kind of activities that we want them to do, they're also discarded quite readily, sold into problematic circumstances, sold into the slaughterhouse industries, the blood farms. In the case of donkeys, the donkey skin trade, um, and and all of the remnants that they extract from the body of these animals. So it's a in many cases, I think it's a deep journey into a real moral question about our relationship with other equids that is front and center of us. Now we know better. I think the question now is not, the science that would inform this discussion, but whether or not we have the, moral aptitude to do anything about it.
But how can we develop it? Because in a way, I was speaking, and after that, I have another question about trauma. I was speaking with Buck Brannaman. He spoke about how the horses shaped the history of the state. And it's now that I'm here, it's a very deep part of the culture. Like in Israel, people will not go in boots and hats on the streets, and like it's kind of the daily life here. And yet, you would expect that people that, I don't know, being around horses a lot of hours a day, gonna treat them differently. And I'm asking what we need to develop or how we need to develop that moral level.
Yeah, I wish I had a perfect answer to that. I think in my own work, one of the ways that we believe that we might respond to this is starting to recognize that our laws are insufficient, um, because the persons, as you say, the persons who are in the quote unquote, cowboy culture, um, or even some of the methodology that had been prominent in the cowboy culture. And interestingly, I think, it's worth mentioning that, the best cowboys and cowgirls of our current day are changing, because one of the things that they are learning is that actually the persons who seem to have the most uh the most skill with horses are not the persons who treat them the harshest, but are actually persons who have spent time with deeper understanding of the psychology of those particular animals. And so even in the therapeutic, it's one of the reasons why we see so many crossover cowboys and cowgirls working in the therapeutic arena, is that we're recognizing that if we really want to coexist with horses, we actually need to understand them better and have better relationships with them. And that doesn't come from being harsher. It comes from actually being better communicators. It comes from being more humane, and utilizing the information that we know about horses and the specific welfare, species specific welfare in the individual as well. And that's an important thing to underline, is that whenever we talk about species specific welfare, we also need to bring right alongside it the individual recognition that not every horse is identical to the horse standing next to it in terms of its needs. So some of the work that we're doing on this question is starting to look more carefully at the rules, the laws, and the policies that drive and influence this. Now, the United States is quite far behind the rest of the world in this regard. Um, and what I'm talking about here is really could be boiled down to this question around whether or not animals should be seen as property. At the moment, the way the law is written, and the primary law that protects horses is the Animal Welfare Act of the United States. And we know that the animal welfare law is the most basic needs, um, would determine that you're treating your animal acceptably if you're meeting kind of the most basic of needs. Anything short of meeting those needs could be considered, cruelty directed at that animal. But I think the question, that goes the other direction is there anything above the Animal Welfare Act that we need to be doing with these animals? And one of them is that we actually need to start to see other non-humans as more than just physical property. So they have the same legal rights as the shoes on your feet or the couch that you're sitting on. Um, the in the United States, animals can be bought and sold, moved around, separated from their families. There's almost no conditions that dictate anything related to our responsibility to their emotional lives. Um, and that actually is changing around the world. There's about 33 different countries that have started to recognize animal sentience or animal consciousness as a part of their laws, um, and their declarations, including a recognition that they actually should not be considered property. But the United States continues to view animals this way. And I would say to a large degree that is driven mostly by the fact that we're a country that has commodified animals and animal agriculture largely for the purpose of money, and profit. And so the horse industry is one of those industries that has a lot of money invested in these being animals that can be bred, raised, sold, raced, uh, you know, done with whatever basically we would like. and then move them around when we don't want them anymore, discard them or sell them for slaughter at the end of that period of time. And there's very little, very little legal framework that alters that really. So I think that's one of the areas that becomes a question. And in the United States, it often gets conflated with this accusation that if you're an animal rights person, that there's something wrong with you, that you're a radical, that you're, animal rights activists, if they are engaged in any kind of animal rights and are arrested, can be charged as domestic terrorists. So there's very harsh treatments of persons who are trying to protect animals, even though those individuals actually don't hurt anybody. They're only trying to protect an animal, but they're treated as though they're engaged in some kind of highly devious behavior, and sometimes the punishments are very harsh. Um, right. So I think it's an interesting question. Do we believe animals should have more rights? Or not? And how would that change what you're asking? Would that change, some of the ways that we might consider their well-being? Um, I think it would. I think it's a necessity, and there'll be a time and a place where it does change. But I think the United States is probably way behind the rest of the world, or a good portion of the world in many ways, even though the United States likes to think of itself as having these advanced animal welfare laws. Those laws really are not protecting animals, in terms of what you're describing.
So we need to be able to think about a way to develop that compassion, but I think you suggested an interesting idea regard to effectiveness. And that's the other thing that I want to ask about. First of all, about trauma. From my perspective as an Israeli now under war, process-wise, what is the mechanism that work, and how does it work different when the animal is in stress or without stress? And if you have even evidence to that, it's amazing
Yeah, well,
also.
we do have quite a bit of evidence. I think actually one of the areas, that has developed in the animal assisted services field is the capacity to track biomarkers. The neurochemistry, really, the individual neurochemistry of individuals, and not only the humans, but also the animals involved. Um, and what that evidence shows us is that in being in the presence of an animal that feels completely safe, um, has a synchronicity or a impact on the other individuals in close proximity. So this is easy to imagine what this would look like if you're standing if you're sitting in a room with other people, and without knowing exactly what's happening, all those people jump out of their chair and run out of the room. What are you going to do you think?
Gonna jump and ask questions later.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly, right. And what you're observing by jumping up and wanting to know what's going on is your body is upregulating to get you up out of your chair and potentially out of harm's way because you're not sure what's happening, and your body is regulating your neurobiology, which is a necessary evolutionary tool for being in a threatening circumstance, right, or a problematic circumstance. So we know that people who live in constant combat zones or conflict zones, probably a lot of your family members and colleagues in Israel, and people all over the planet, in these war zones, uh, are impacted. Their physiology is routinely impacted by living constantly in that. One of the things that happens when you live in a permanent set of threat, is you start to find ways to control that through often varying kinds of cognitive maneuvers that include disengagement, dissociation. Some cases, it's as straightforward as things like people who are starting to use substances, uh, you know, um, mental health and emotional problems, or are walking around totally dysregulated all the time, right? And that which can be, we know in children who grow up in dangerous households, actually grows their brain physically differently than kids who are not growing up in that circumstance. They have different brains as a result of it. So if you're putting a client in the presence of a horse that is also feeling very safe, there is the potential that the information that is gleaned, it's usually subconscious. We refer to it as neuroception of safety, because the necessity of this particular aspect of our neurological system is that it's not an intentional, or let's put it this way, a conscious cognitive process. So by the time you jump out of your seat and run out of the room, um, you're not sitting in your chair, asking the question, should I get up out of my chair? Or writing a list, the pros and cons of moving, if I have a truck bearing down on me. I mean, our bodies are designed to respond pre-consciously to the safety, the concept of neuroception of safety. Um, and as a result, and that's, by the way, how other animals also communicate with each other. One of the importance of a herd of horses is they get a lot of information from the other members of their herd. Same thing with a family, a pack of wolves or other individuals being around us. One of the most devastating aspects of being isolated and alone is we have no information about safety. It's one of the reasons why being in a solitary confinement cell as a prisoner, or a lone horse who's kept all by itself, in many cases becomes depressed, shuts down, or is very distressed by that experience of being isolated, because they have no feedback loop or information coming to them, and it wears you out. So if you're the only person trying to determine your own safety, it's a much more exhausting process to experience. Um, so, I mean, I think to your question, the first thing that we can do, and by the way, I should just mention, we have a brand new declaration on animal sentience in animal assisted services that I can send you and you can post if you'd like. It's a sign-on document. It's intended to establish a new concept called sentience-centered practice, which would place the actual emotional life, the sentience of the animal at the center of the therapeutic intervention, um, which is what we believe is probably the necessity, and what the science is really telling us is the necessity. This has been now adopted by the International Association of Human Animal Interaction Organizations, IAHIO. If you know IAHIO, they have accepted this concept as a declaration, published it on their website as well. Um, so I don't know. To me, that's kind of what we can do. We can elevate this concept of sentience, start to have it be relevant to our interactions with other non-humans and each other, take more care to establish that, and also recognize that that information is, even if we don't speak exactly the same language, we can observe much of the communication coming from another non-human sentient being that tells us how they're doing, and that we should be respecting that in if we're incorporating them in therapeutic work.
What I'm curious is somehow you're saying it's going against the logic, like it's even less effective, like therapy like that.
Well, I think if you're trying to do therapy with an animal that is not giving, doesn't want to be there, is in distress or in one form or another, is resistant to the experience and is finding it, you know, uncomfortable or distressing or painful. Um, yeah, it's actually worse than neutral. It would be worse than just a neutral situation. It would actually likely create risk factors for them and your clients. Because one of the things we also know is that being in the presence of animals that are being harmed or in distress actually create problematic outcomes for human beings. We've known that for a long time, by the way. And so if we wanted to create somebody who's callous, quite antisocial, doesn't really care about other people, is capable of harming other people, then how do you do how, it's a terrible experiment to imagine. But if we wanted to do that, the way we would do that is we would grow that individual up in a home where there's routinely cruelty directed at sentient members of that household, including the animals, the non-human animals in that environment. So it's cruelty is never going to be without consequence relative to human developmental factors and clinical outcomes. So it becomes the single most important dimension of clinical work is to get this right.
So important, the evidence to that, and I can have example on that. I was in the past working in the south of Israel, and during war we did groups, and while doing Tibetan bulls work and tuning fork work with those horses, the treatment was better than any other thing that I try to do to improve
Mhm.
the effectiveness of that. Not supervision, not like the. So
Hmm.
that's incredible to attach the research to that, or the ability to do it. Um, what are Let's say I want to be a better therapist with animals to people under trauma or suffering from trauma. What can I do beside better care of the animals that we said that a lot?
Well, I think one of the things that we can do is evaluate start with recognizing that even the question of whether we should be in utilizing or, and use that term use of an animal, right? That has been always questioned around this issue. Uh, those end up becoming deeper moral examinations of the choices that we make in our own lives, the way we think about interacting with other non-humans. So of course, one part of it is taking good care of the animals, but the other part of it is starting to look deeper at our own inclinations, our own human arrogance, our own patience, our own capacity for regulation ourselves, in these circumstances. We have a lot of challenges right now in the world relative to the way we think about what, our own power, our own privilege, our own capacity to impact others. Um, and these go hand in hand. And I think the likelihood that we are going to continue to treat non-humans as, kind of our own tools to be exploited in whatever way, suits us is a real risk for this profession. I think one of the first things that we could do would all become much more convincing advocates for animals being considered legally more than property. Um, and and for us to be looking for those changes to occur in our lifetime. Right now, we could be doing that. We could be asking the larger entities that fund our professions, the universities and research institutes and the big funders of the research to be much more intentional about that very commitment. Um, they aren't right now. Universities for the most part don't have not taken that issue on very directly. Um, big animal care companies, the big food supply and pet supply companies also make, millions and billions of dollars selling products to people who have animals, but they have not taken a position on animals being more than just property. Um, so, it could be that we could be looking for systemic and widespread social change in this area together. I think that would be one of the things that we could do that would be practical. It would be amazing. It might be inconvenient at times because if we give animals more agency, right, or more recognition of their ability to make decisions or have opinions or, all of those things, then all of a sudden we have this obligation to be responsive to it. But that's the point, right? I mean, the point is if we want to deepen our relationship with other animals, that's when we're going to have to do that. We're going to have to do that. And that's the work that I want to do. And that's the work that I'm currently spending most of my time on.
Wow, amazing. So, in a way, we're saying they are making us more humane if we're going to be willing to be humble enough to
Yeah.
see it.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting if you break down the word humane, right? The core emphasis in the term humane is this question around what it might mean to be human. Um, so really building in real recognition that when we are human, we have the ability to be humane. Doesn't mean we are, but we have the ability to. And I think that is a good place to start. Um, and invite your listeners and your colleagues in your work to revisit this idea of rights for animals, or legal standing is another way to think about it. Do they have legal standing? In the United States, there was a time and a place where human beings were also considered property. Enslaved persons could not bring a case on their own behalf because they were considered property. They had no protections under the law. I think we now all know that that was one of the largest moral failures in the United States and in other places that enslave people. Um, and there are alternatives to that, right? I mean, I'm not comparing necessarily every slave to an animal, but I think one of the things that we do need to recognize is that it's not a radical idea to imagine an animal being more than just property. That's not a
So,
radical
thank
idea at
you.
all.
Thank you
It's
for taking the
actually what the
time
science
and
has told
listening to
us and taught us,
those
and now we need to respond.
very
So
important ideas.
I think that's where
I
I
hope that
hope
you
we
will
go
take
with it. And um,
all of
I am going
the
to have to wrap
all of
up
the
here
things
because
that was
I have to
mentioned in the
move on to
conversation, at least
another meeting this
as a
morning.
question to
But
think
I've
about,
really
to
enjoyed
wonder,
having a chance to
to
talk with you about it. I
meditate
hope this
on,
has been
to
helpful.
reflect. Yeah,
Because
I
thank
think all
you
of
so much. It was an amazing
the stuff that Philip
conversation, and I
says
think it's important
is
to
very,
share
very,
it.
very
We'll stay in
important
touch.
for us.
Yeah, please. Yeah, let me know if you have
Um,
questions, or
people
we'll
that
stay in
love
touch for sure.
horses, being with horses, love animals, being around animals. At least to think about it, to give it our attention, and 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 I think from thinking about those stuff we can behave better if we improve the quality of our thinking or the question that we are asking ourselves. We can be more compassionate about animals and better human.